Aloha Mavericks from all around the world. My name's Mike Kelly and I'm super excited to bring you yet another episode of Unmapped, a podcast exploring the world through the eyes of remarkable humans on extraordinary journeys. I hang out with pioneers, adventurers and trailblazers from around the planet, hearing their stories and unlocking the lessons learned from a life on and off the beaten path. And just a little bit of housekeeping, if you're enjoying the show, please consider sharing it with your friends, following and reviewing us wherever you listen to it, and check us out on Instagram at UnmappedPod. It would mean the absolute world, and I guess you get to come and hang out, which could be fun. All right, let's get into the show. Dr. Kaushik Ram is a neuroscientist, author, board member, and inventor who's been recommended to me for this podcast a couple of times. We've been planning to do this episode for a while. I'd been in touch with him, but it just never really worked out. And now I know why it didn't work out, because this was the perfect time to record this episode with Kaushik. Kaushik has lived an incredible life. After having a near-death experience, he awoke to, I would say, his true nature as the universe, really. And from there began a journey of trying to understand what had actually happened to him, which led him into essentially reverse engineering from a neuroscientific perspective, his awakening by studying neuroscience. From there, he decided to write a book about what he had learned, and the culmination of writing that book resulted in him living in a cave for nearly 3 months in Thailand and living and breathing as a part of nature, as someone who was relying on their instincts in nature. That led him to a deep dive into understanding the role that instinct has within a human being, the importance of instinct to a human being, and whether we are actually really human at all as we start to lose our instinctual nature. This has culminated with him doing a TEDx talk on the role of instinct for humans and the way that technology is threatening our connection to our own instincts, which actually ended up being censored by TED. So it's viewable on YouTube and you can see the links that we've included. I watched the talk and was absolutely blown away by the fact that this talk got censored. It feels like a really important discussion point to be had as we launch forward into a new wave of tech with AI. And so we wanted to have a bit of a deep dive over this conversation. I highly recommend that you head to check out his TEDx talk on YouTube. It's something that you cannot find by searching. You need the link, which is why we've provided it. So please check that on the Unmapped link tree or on Instagram or in the show notes. Have a watch. It's 13 minutes long, and then definitely recommend coming back to have a listen to this episode. I think it's an important dialogue. Kaushik has an important perspective to give to the future of humanity, particularly in the age of AI. And yeah, we really explore what it means to be human and discuss different things. There's a little bit of a jam on immortality and transhumanism, what that means from an ethical or spiritual standpoint as humans. And yeah, I really hope you enjoy this episode. This has been a long introduction, but also necessary. Enjoy the episode. Check out the TED Talk, and we will speak to or hear from you, or you'll hear from us soon. All right, enjoy the episode. Peace. Kaushik, how you doing, man? Thank you so much for coming on the show. I've been looking forward to this one for couple of weeks, ever since you sort of wheeled back into my radar with a bit of a bang. How are you doing today?
Yeah, pretty amazing, Mike. It's lovely to be here, and I'm really excited to get into this conversation.
I am very excited too. I love the genesis where this conversation has come from. You actually, a friend of mine, Orshi, who I don't think has ever actually met you, she recommended that you come on the show last year or the year before, and I think we had a very brief Instagram exchange, but then just life happened, and so it's nice to be back. You've come into my world from a couple of different fields, from a friend Nicole Gibson from the tech world, and from a bunch of friends who have really gotten around a TEDx talk that you've done recently from a community of people that I hang out with and bang some drums and dance around a fire with castle drumming. So very much from two different parts of my life, technology and nature. And it's funny because they're exactly the two things that we're going to end up talking about today. So it's really nice to have you on the show. That TEDx talk has been the genesis of the rekindling for this conversation. Why don't you tell us a little bit about neuroscientist, and what I think most fascinatingly about how you briefly introduce yourself within the TEDx talk. Neuroscientist, but was writing machine learning code. So not only have you done brain surgery, but you also know how to write code for AI. Like that's a pretty, there's two pretty niche skill sets. Like, who are you, and how did you end up doing both of those things throughout a career?
Yeah, that's a fascinating way of looking at it, Mike. So obviously, from the outside, it doesn't really merge together. But when you're a scientist, when I was actually doing brain surgery, taking all those signals through microelectrodes inserted into the brain and reading all of that out, it's basically a lot of data, which Excel sheets are not prepared for. So you have to write code in order to process the data manually. And so that's where my coding journey began. When I finished up with neurosurgery, which was actually on animals, by the way, I was working with sharks and scorpionfish, some of the two most dangerous creatures in the ocean. So when I moved on from that, I did not want to work with animals because it was taking an emotional toll, and I didn't think I could go on with a career like this. So I instead chose to work with humans and work with MRI. And with MRI, we again witnessing a lot of data. And so that's where I started writing code to process imaging. And that was eventually deployed by the University of Sydney. So with computer vision, we can look at a brain and within 3 seconds map out the entire brain and build out a report. And not just for one brain at a time, but thousands at a time. So what was initially just basic coding has turned into a fairly powerful medical tool that frees up neurologists' time. So we've deployed this across 43 countries, 190 clinics around the world, housing 93,000 patients. So you can see how the initial coding and neuroscience sort of evolved as technology co-evolved with it.
Because coding is a totally new language, like, are you a bit of an autodidact and just taught yourself how to do that? Or did you go through a course to learn how to do that? It's pretty impressive.
I did one computer science course, which taught me how to use Java. But for the rest of it, I basically learned from scratch on the job.
Wow. Okay. That is, yeah, I mean, I suppose it is just like learning a language, but that's pretty impressive. And why neuroscience? Why did you decide to go into that field in the first place? Was it something that you always wanted to do? Was this something you went into pretty well straight after school, or knowing that's what you wanted to do? Where was the inspiration to go into the brain from?
So I had no interest in neuroscience. I loved nature. And so I did study animal behavior, physiology, and postgraduate actually led me into studying paleontology and anthropology. So it's really into nature. When I finished my postgraduate studies, finished my master's, I was still in the realm of animal behavior. That's why I was working with sharks. However, being fascinated by nature also led me to some pretty remote places around the globe. One of it was the highlands of Papua New Guinea, where I had a near-death experience. And unable to find an explanation for what happened to me, I studied neuroscience to reverse engineer an explanation for what I inherently knew. That story I've shared on other podcasts, which I go into more detail. It's also written in my book, Hidden World, which I wrote while living inside of a cave. So it's fairly well mapped out if anyone's interested in that story. That particular story requires a podcast in itself to unpack.
Yeah.
So, because I couldn't find the answers of what happened to me in books that I read, it just didn't remotely come close. I studied neuroscience to understand the brain from a spiritual sense. That was the entry point. And because medicine does not really look at the brain from that perspective, I ended up doing traditional neuroscience, which was initially spent 6 years in psychiatry and 3 years in neurology, studying the brain at its, at a very high level scientific process.
Wow. Okay. So that was a pretty impactful. I mean, I suppose a near-death experience almost always is a very impactful experience that one will have in their life. Without going into it, I mean, there's, like you said, there's a book, Hidden Worlds, the book was called.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool. So without going into the story itself, do you want to maybe try and describe very top level why that experience was so impactful for you and what studying neuroscience for nearly 10 years ended up actually showing you about that experience?
Yeah, so that experience, for many, they would describe it as a dissolution of ego. And for me, it was a complete wiping out of my identity. I was a clean slate. That meant my mind had to repopulate back and recreate a new identity, which for me didn't make sense because I was fairly comfortable being nothing. After that experience, the material world failed to make any sense to me anymore. Emptiness became more beautiful than existence. I did not want to return back to the real world. And so I forced myself, like I had at that point the option of going down that path of those who have had these experiences. They end up becoming gurus. And I saw what happened to those people, and I didn't want to follow their footsteps. Instead, I chose science deliberately because I did not want to appear like a fool, which for the most part, if you start talking about these things, people will not listen to you. I had a girlfriend at the time, and she said to me, if you don't stop talking about these things, I'll leave you. And so she left, and I stopped talking about these things. And it was the most beautiful thing because I just didn't have a grasp on what had happened to me. So it took another 5 years for me to return back to society. And science really helped that because science gave me a language and a thought structure and analytical pattern that I could then use to rigorously map what had happened to me. And at that point also I realized instead of telling people, which is a very deeply personal and sacred experience, it's much easier to teach the body. If you look at someone who's under duress, maybe they have had injury or a very traumatic experience, in that very acute moment, it is very difficult to communicate anything to the mind. The mind is shut down. They don't have the capacity to listen to anyone. And so it's much easier to talk to the body in those circumstances. And we as humans have become so far in our material world that a language from the eternal, you may say, is incomprehensible to the mind. And so we have to find another entry point. And for me, that entry point was the body. So even though I studied neuroscience, a large part of my work is to do with the body and ultimately to do with the heart, because the heart really is what governs the entire nervous system, and that shapes our thought.
Wow. Okay. I can relate to having had a similar experience, but it's weird. The saying if the I had the experience is not actually correct, because there was no I to have the experience. The experience was realized or had because of the cessation, like the falling away of the I. Yeah, it only happened to me a year ago, so it's nice to know I've got at least another 4 years of sitting around trying to work out what on earth happened to me. But yeah, that's extremely powerful, and I can really, really relate in the way of how that completely changes your life and why you decided to spend 10 years studying something in order to explain it, because I don't think I'm ever going to stop. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. And now I definitely need to read your book. So it took you into neuroscience, and I'm now going to have to try my best to get away from that topic and into the topic that we are here to discuss. So you wrote that book, Hidden Worlds, as a result of this near-death experience, this dropping away of ego, this living in emptiness, and trying to understand all of that. I presume you mentioned in your TEDx talk that you went to a cave to write a book. Was that the book that you were going to write in the cave in Thailand?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, cool. And you get there, and I would love to hear a little bit more about it. It sounds like you've done a couple of big journeys into nature. There was this, and then you also mentioned in a survival expedition in Africa. You go to this cave and realize that it is far less conducive to writing a book than you initially thought. Obviously, with a 13-minute TED Talk, we're not getting the nitty-gritty about what this experience was for you. Where did you end up, and was it at all what you thought you were going to get when you went there?
Yeah, so I must actually set the record straight, because I didn't, as I explained in the TED Talk, jump online to find a cave and then went to live in
It wasn't an Airbnb.
No, definitely not. So I had the idea of writing a book for 10 years, and for something that you hold in your heart for 10 years, and then the moment arises when it needs to be written. When you hear that calling, there is no negotiation. You just go. And when that moment came for me, I knew I had to write this book, but I was living in Sydney, and Sydney was not the right environment for me to connect so deep within myself to draw out what I needed to say. And so I started searching. Initially, it was the idea of going to a Nordic castle and, finding a isolating environment there. But I did actually search online, and I couldn't find one. And so eventually I was having conversations with people, and Thailand kept coming up. And Thailand has not been on my radar. I don't like Thailand at that time. And I had no interest in Thailand. And so when I was thinking about this, obviously my mind had resistance, but my heart had already decided. And I don't negotiate with my heart. As I said, my entire foundation of my neuroscience is built on top of experiences of the heart. So when my heart had decided, okay, we have to go to Thailand, I didn't resist. I went along with it. And within a month of that intention, I was in Thailand. And it took me 2 months to write what I held in my heart for 10 years. And once that was written, I knew that it wasn't complete. There was something missing. So I couldn't publish this book. So I stayed on this island. And I wasn't really doing much. I was basically on this island for no good reason. And eventually I met another author who was living on that island. And he was a British author who was living in a cave. And we developed a friendship. And eventually, when he was leaving, he said, "Would you like to take over the custodianship of my cave?" I went and checked it out, and it was an immediate yes. And so I started living in this cave with no really good reason to be there.
Amazing.
But when I started living in this cave, my habits and patterns started to change. For example, my sleeping pattern started to change. I'd light fire in the evening because there was no other source of light. There was no electricity and there was no water. And so when I'd light fire, and you're just sitting in nature, watching the forest, you tend to fall asleep fairly easily listening to the nightlife. And I'd fall asleep a few hours past sunset, and then I'd naturally wake up around 2 in the morning, and I'd realize, the fire had died out. I'd put some more wood into the fire, and at that time, ideas would come into my mind almost barbarically, and I'd jot these down on pieces of paper, and then I'll fall back asleep. I couldn't fall asleep until those ideas were out of my head, so it had to come out. And then during the day, I would translate that dream state into words. And those became the final chapters of my book. So that was what led me to finalize this work. And once I wrote the last words, I knew that was it. I literally stopped writing, got up, took a walk on the beach, had a little cry. And I knew it was done.
That is such an incredible story. So were the ideas that were coming to you at night related to the book, and it was actually living in the cave that gave you the natural space to have those ideas arise within you to finish the book? Or was it the actual process and experience of being in the cave and living in the cave and the way that you lived and the habits that you formed that provided the necessary ingredients to finish the book?
Yeah, living in the cave changed me. It was like,
I bet,
how our ancestors lived 2.5 million years ago. And of course, I want to make clear that I wasn't entirely out of civilization. The nearest resort was 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers away. So I'd obviously just go down to the nearest resort. And I did. Every few days, I'd go down, charge my laptop. You didn't really have the opportunity to use internet that much. You only had 2 gigs of data that you could use over a period of time. And it was really expensive to get those 2 gigs. So you had to use it wisely. So other than the few emails and the random Instagram post, I wasn't really online at all. And so when I was in the cave, you are in communion with nature.
Mm.
When you exit the cave, you hear the loud noises in people's mind. And so I tend to stay away from people so that I could hear my own voice. And that was what was coming out while I was living in the cave.
Wow, that is just such a cool story. When I say cool, I don't mean cool dude. I mean that is so profound. I can only imagine the sense of change that occurred, and like having done very minimalist kind of compared to that, like I'm a Vipassana meditator at times. I do silent retreats and spend a lot of that in a cell, like a 1-by-1 cell by myself, or I'm in my own little room. And so unless we're in the dining room eating, there's not a lot of, I guess, connection to other people, and things slow down so much. And the way that you begin to understand and even just see, like for me at least, not just the thoughts and the feelings and what was going on inside my body, but becoming able to witness and see the process through which those experiences occur, like the contractions through which like a thought or a feeling actually kind of happen, and how a thought or a feeling will grab the other, and sort of like it becomes a really interesting discovery of self. And so I can only imagine the differences to that. Like everyone has their own different kind of self-discovery processes and their own experiences and insights and wisdom that come from these experiences. But I can only imagine what spending that much time and so much more connected to nature, I feel like, would be the distinction there. Within a meditation retreat, I'm still sitting in a cell, I'm still sleeping in a bed, and there's not that same communion with nature, like probably more like a communion with my body and my heart. Maybe there was a really real communion with those, which is like how the cessation experience occurred for me, like a total communion, particularly with heart and the vibration of love. But what you're talking about, I can only imagine the feeling of being in total communion with nature, almost to the point where the line between self and nature, for those two things to commune, would go, and it's just nature, and you are just nature. Did you ever have moments where you just felt like you were, it's so weird to say, because as soon as you say you feel like you're a part of, it's like there's an I to be a part of it. Is there a time where it just all melded together and it was all just happening?
It took a while. Initially, when I moved into the cave, a big part of my life is working out. So I tried to hang up gymnastic rings in the cave, and every attempt at doing that failed. And it was as if the cave really did not admire that energy. And so I had to readapt to the rhythm of nature. And that meant I hung the rings at the resort, and I'd go down there to do my workout. But the cave had a different rhythm. There's a saying, sort of, when did we split from the apes? When did humans become humans and ape become ape? And when you living in the cave, it becomes very apparent that we are apes. We never split. And there's monkeys in the canopy, and they're going about doing their business. They're probably having sex, and sort of leaves are just falling down. But you realize that every action you take in nature reacts to you. And you might be sitting and you see a rustle, hear a rustle in the leaves. I know that rustle, that's a silver cobra passing through. And you hear a different rustle. You go, yeah, that's the lace monitor. It has a different sound when it travels through the leaf litter. So
Holy
all
shit.
these experiences, you are connected to nature. Every sound, every movement has meaning. A leaf falling off a tree, like, which direction are the leaves falling? That's the direction of the wind. These things have meaning. Tells you whether you're upwind or downwind.
That's incredible, man. This is where the conversation begins about instinct. Tell me about it.
I think this is a introduction into why I didn't talk specifically about instinct in my TED Talk, even though the talk is about instinct. If people listen very closely, they might figure out that the first time I'm talking about instinct, actually about gut instinct, our relationship to food, and the fact that when food is delivered to your doorstep, you don't really have that fulfillment as when you were out hunting in the wild and you expend all that energy and then you consume the food and it restores that energy, and then that's the healthy dopamine pathway of expending energy and then receiving reward. When that pathway is hijacked, now that instinctual, that gut instinct is now deprived. And so I mention these things in the TED Talk, but in fleeting ways. Read between the lines, and they pay close attention to what I'm saying, and they'll start picking up on these things. I talk about maternal instinct. My parents grew up in a village. The village was literally sugarcane farms scattered around in Fiji. And on those farms, you could, if you fall short of rice, you run along to the neighbor and they might have some spare rice, and then you run back to your farm, and it was that village supporting you, because farms are seasonal and sometimes you run low on crops, sometimes crops go bad. So everyone's supporting each other. What you don't have, someone else provides. When I was growing up, I grew up around uncles, grandparents, and so you were sheltered within this very supportive family structure. When I saw my younger brother and sister grow up, they grew up in a nuclear family, a stable, secure environment, biological mother, biological father, relationships between siblings, and that is held strong. When I came to Western culture, I witnessed the breakdown of the nuclear family and single parents, stepmoms, stepdads, and as years went by, I saw that even single moms weren't there for their kids. It was kids being raised by iPads. And so we are getting further and further and further away from the parental instincts that we have. And I was at a conference a few years ago, and there was a woman who came up on stage and proudly declared there's no such thing as a nuclear family. And she was offering a fertility budget that could be bolted onto your salary package. And this was meant to be a wonderful thing for women, because women are working longer in their jobs. And so they might not have the opportunity to have kids. So instead, they can have a fertility budget that offers adoption, surrogacy, IVF, artificial wombs. And with that, women don't even have to take maternity leave, so they can they can work longer and compete with men. And so you're making women into men, but stripping them away from what makes them a woman.
Yeah.
So
this is. You can keep going. This is
Yeah.
fascinating conversation. Keep going.
So we talk about how protecting the maternal instinct is what extends the future of humanity. And then I talk about the survival instinct, which is very well known, fight or flight. And that shapes all of our cognitive behaviors. The moment our heart rate changes, it changes the way our brain thinks. Higher heart rate, we go into tunnel vision cognition, and that has a very specific pattern of thought. You're hypervigilant. You find all the wrong things in a situation. You go back into coping mechanisms that may have protected you when you're growing up, but have outlived their welcome. It doesn't help you as an adult. So all of these cognitive patterns are there when you are running under fear. And what happens when these very basic behaviors are now mimicked by large language models? So a few weeks ago, ChatGPT 4 Omni was released, and it mimics the human voice, and it holds conversation better than most humans can. And there's currently, I think that it might turn into a lawsuit, but they used Scarlett Johansson's voice, or a replica of it, without her permission. So you've got this very seductive voice.
She wasn't very happy about that either.
No, so her voice was used in that movie. And now we're actually seeing a real life version of that. And so you're stealing someone's voice, and you have got seduction on demand in a handheld device, and it's able to hold conversations better than a human being. How does this manipulate our survival behavior? These are the questions that are raised, and it's interesting that I talked about this in my TED Talk, and a month or two later, ChatGPT 4 Omni is released.
Okay. Wow. Thank you for that. It's incredible to having allowed you the space to drop in a little bit more to your talk, how much you actually packed into that. Like 13 minutes, the TEDx talk itself was 13 minutes, and this very beautiful flow of information you gave woven into the story that you told. Like, so much of this needs unpacking and fleshing out. One of the questions I had for you within this interview was, what is instinct? And I just thought of it as this somewhere between the survival instinct and the gut instinct. I think like there's this general thing that knows, what it needs to do in a certain situation, and I almost would connect that to the heart. Like there's a level of instinct that comes from the heart, or maybe the heart and the gut talking. I'm not 100% sure, but to think about the maternal instinct piece, the survival instinct piece, the gut instinct piece, all at the same time, and notice that they're actually different flavors or perspectives from which to engage with the idea of instinct is fascinating. And then the broader context of what you're speaking about, which is that technology, or the way that we are living our lives in this day and age, is numbing our instinctual selves. It is taking us away from what, now I understand why you said this is the core experience of being human. This is what makes us human, because instinct is not just survival instinct. It covers so much more. So if you had to define instinct, given that I feel like what instinct really is almost the behaviors that humans do without knowing why we do them. They are the natural behaviors of humans that we can't actually in our brain go, oh yeah, I know why I did that. Like no one can actually explain why a mother protects their child. Like it may, of course, because we've had a whole humanity's worth of evidence for it, it makes sense. But in that moment, or why you would jump in front of a train for your family, there's some base level thing that exists within us that we don't know how to explain, and we don't know why it occurs, and that is instinct. Like is that like a fair enough way of describing what instinct is?
Yeah, so in biology and psychology, instinct is really defined as those behaviors that predate human cognition. So even
Cool.
when you look at a bird in a nest, even if it's not seen its parents fly, it has that instinct to jump out of the nest. Why? Don't you think it's against the laws of nature? It's like almost suicidal jumping off a nest. Why does a bird do that? Why does it have the need to jump out of the nest? It's genetically programmed, it's instinctual. It has to do it, it has no choice in the matter. So this is an example of what instinct is.
Gotcha. Okay. Gotcha. So it's yeah, okay. Predate. I love it. That's cool. Oh my God, I'm learning a lot right now. This is amazing. You are a fascinating and well considered man, Kaushik. In the interest of time, I have realized that we probably should have scheduled 2.5 to 3 hours for this conversation now that we're going, because I am not even close to ready to move this ship along, but along we must ship. I want to get into like leading up to, and I don't think I've actually explained what happened to your TEDx talk on the show. Actually, we might save that for after, but the argument that you make in your TED talk is that we are, and by the way, it will 100% be in the show notes. It'll be all over the Instagram and the post for this and stuff. The link, it will be there to go and watch this TED talk. And I highly recommend everyone that wants to continue to listen to this podcast, go and listen to the TED talk, because from here on in, we're going to pretty well exclusively be discussing these topics we've been talking about previously within the context of the TED talk. So the broad stroke argument that you made in the TED talk is that we are losing touch with what makes us inherently human, although now I'm starting to think maybe like inherently like just nature in general and pre-human, given that instinct comes from beyond like the things that make us human almost. These are the things that are inherent to life itself rather than life itself for this kind of manifestation of life, given that we don't jump out of nests like birds do. Like they have different instinctual tendencies to the ones that we do. But these instinctual tendencies are being lost to us because we have wrapped ourselves in a cocoon of technology, and we are also kind of scared of like what the butterfly is going to look like that comes out. The convergence of technology and the humans. Are we already losing what we are as humans? And as technology begins to be able to augment into the human experience, do we begin to completely lose what makes us human? You described us as a species in captivity, and I thought this was an incredibly provocative but profoundly important statement to reflect on, thinking about how I felt connecting more with nature. It's something I never did growing up. I was always in the games and stuff like this, and connecting back to my connection to the trees and to just fire, like making a fire. Oh my God, as a man, there is just something about making a fire that is that has to be instinct, because I don't know what on earth goes on when I make a fire, but feels like what I'm supposed to be doing, you know? And so there's this connection that we're losing because we don't need to make fires because we have lights, and we don't need to hunt because we have Deliveroo. And some of this I think is incredibly positive. I think that this is a very nuanced debate, and I don't in any way, shape or form want to pretend like we're going to get a fulsome look at this done in the next 25 minutes. We're not, but the general philosophy that our mental health is suffering because we are getting lost in our worlds of technology, the fact that we are losing our connection to nature and our natural instincts is because of that. I think rather than it being like we were sort of saying before we went on air, rather than it being us proposing this entirely new theory of like a way of living, this as a part of a broader discussion of where humanity is going is critical at the point that we are at in the development of particularly artificial intelligence. Like, things are going to get wacky, and connection to who and what we are becomes so important. And so I want to be able to have a bit of a jam on this idea that we are a species in captivity, because I think a lot of people would sort of look at that and say, well, no, we're a species that are free, like we have dominion over the planet, etc. But we're losing something within that.
Yeah, so this is really the premise of my talk, of how distant we have become to nature and therefore ourselves. And technology used to be tools that we use to facilitate our survival, like a chimp picking up a branch trying to bring down a mango. That is just an extension of itself, using a branch to do that. At no point in history did technology control us. We were controlling technology. Now, when social media came, we had the first contact with technology that manipulates the human mind. And when the power was realized, it became a race to the bottom of the brainstem. And technology companies will openly admit this. They know that dopamine pathways are stimulated. That's why you have the bell icon. It literally comes from that Pavlovian conditioning that, ancient psychological experiments did, of cueing a bell with a reward. And so now that has been used to manipulate us. No one's questioning that we're not addicted to our devices. It's obvious. We are addicted to our devices, especially kids. They don't know anything other than that. That race to the bottom of the brainstem then transitioned into something, I guess, a little bit more darker, which is transhumanism. I don't know if you've ever spoken with transhumanists. They speak as if they're an entirely different species altogether. And we are at the moment witnessing this separation of humankind. Not in the past, isolated group would evolve independently. That's why we have all the different races. But that was a geographical isolation that created unique genetics. What we are witnessing now is a technological isolation. So,
And almost a socioeconomic. It will be a socioeconomic.
oh yeah, it would be tiered, of course. So if we are in a technological isolation, those who are native will go the natural way, and those who are enhanced, from neural link to prosthetics to gene editing like CRISPR to, the artificial wombs we're talking about, and artificial blood, that's why I say, there are those who believe in mutating our brain and body towards artificial standards of beauty, longevity, and intelligence. These things are actively happening right now. This whole idea of immortality, if you go to Silicon Valley, there's huge amounts of funding going into space exploration, and equally a huge number of funding going to longevity. They're treating age as a disease. And they think if they create a digital clone, that will lead to immortality. But you can't just live as a digital ghost. That's not human. And the fact that people actively think and move towards this and encourage their children to be brain chipped, they select the type of genes they want their kids to be. Like, this is not ethical. Although if you're screening a child and you find genes that might not be useful or maybe leading to some form of risk of disease, then you can say, hey, can we eliminate this risk gene? But if it means that there's also alleles in there that promote height, eye color, like we can actively select that and it'll pass because it's reducing the risk of disease. So there's always shortcuts into this. And so those who, the transhumanists are actually moving in that direction. It's creating a split in humanity. And this is really what my concern is. No one's really talking about this. The moment you start this conversation, it's the same as any other conversation that was cancelled and eliminated out of discussion. And we've done this repeatedly. And now this conversation, like, how many people do you know are raising concerns around transhumanism?
Not many, particularly in public, and it's interesting the people who are promoting transhumanism. And I think this is such an interesting discussion. Now, I more so wish we had 3 hours. There's a part of me that thinks, could it not be argued that this is the next step in the evolutionary cycle? It's almost like this stuff's cool. I want to see like how far that can go, but another side of me feels like it is disrupting the natural flow of existence. We are starting to really play God here. Like, we are really starting to say this universe is ours and belongs to us in a certain way. I don't even totally know exactly where I sit along all of this, and I'm completely comfortable in saying that. I think that, I do have some friends who are really into longevity, maybe a bit more than transhumanism, and the idea of being able to stay healthier for longer, I definitely like. But yeah, I just don't even, I'm so not sure how I feel about the deep ethical and moral and spiritual, because for me, this is a spiritual question. This is a deep question about what our true goal or purpose on this planet is as a human being. And I'm not sure it's to live forever. There is a natural cycle of birth and death and the flow of the river of existence that wheels its way through all space and time, which is consequently all occurring right now. And the idea of trying to, like, immortality is it's funny. It is a concept that I think is extremely fascinating, and the little sci-fi geek inside of me just like wants to tack, like, let's go there, like, that is cool. But then there's like, as soon as my mind says that, like, everything in my body just goes, dude, like, there's something in here, like, I'm pointing to my heart and my gut that's saying it's not, it actually transcends ethics. I don't even know if this is an ethical discussion. This is deep stuff.
Yeah, so the fact is, so many people are just caught up basically living day to day, paying bills. They don't have time to consider these largely ethical concerns. And this is where new technology keeps getting rolled out without any pushback on it. because people are concerned about paying the bills. They don't have time to think of larger human consequences or how this affects humanity.
Correct.
So that's one thing. But then you start looking at this from the perspective of our track record. When mobile phones came, into existence, we thought it was a great idea, but then it held us hostage. We got to realize that, the average IQ of most countries is around 100. That's not very much. If you give technology like the most advanced technology of our time, maybe, just take the common iPhone, the capacity of that technology is so enormous. But what do people use it for? Like, they're still like sharing memes and cat videos. Like, you think you have something so powerful, and that is what you use it for, like majority of the time. And so we think, the big thinkers of our time are coming up with huge leaps in technology, but it does not mean humanity will follow through on that. We as a species will know what to do with it. And if we look at our track record with these things, it does not look very good.
This is something that I spoke about on a previous podcast. I thought it was actually probably one of the most interesting novel ideas that has come out of Unmapped so far. I was speaking with Kat Dunn, Craig Swan, and Jared Ficklin, and Jared brought up the idea of deployment. Like, we have always looked at wanting to just deploy every piece of technology that we've made, because we've always just been on this absolute, like, the Industrial Revolution was this kind of period of time where everything we were like, it was slower rate of change with technology and everything we were making, like, holy shit, a car, holy shit, this, oh my God, like, these are improving life so much. And arguably, there's things that are always lost when change occurs, but I think we're probably better off as a species for having cars. Maybe not. Maybe we'll wish that we'd never come up with stuff that could be powered by coal. I don't know. But broadly, we've never thought about what happened. Like, should we deploy a piece of technology? The closest we've ever come to that question was the atomic bomb, and we still used it. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, literal killing machines. And we're like, should we use, let's win the war. Like, it just kind of absolutely wild. And so this question of deployment, and I think that the why of how and why we use technology. I mean, I've had a big I've had a big bugbear with this for a couple of years. Like, the fact that the primary reason that technology gets made, and therefore the primary reason a business model for the technology is what it is in order to generate profit. And technology, I don't know whether it would work as a public good. I don't know whether the government would do any better job of deploying it in a certain way. I don't know whether humans can do this any better than we are doing it now. I don't know if just the leftover kind of survival instinct within the broader safety of our Uber Eats and our cars and our food and our houses, like whether that greed and survival instinct is in latching on in a way that creates this need for power and profit and money and all that sort of. I don't actually know if we can fix that without, like, every single person having a near-death experience like yourself, or like spending a year in Vipassana and having a spiritual awakening. I don't actually know what the answer is, but the fact that technology, the single thing that drives humanity forward, is at the service of creating profit, just seems like it's the most counterintuitive thing on the planet right now. Like, one of the most counterintuitive things on the planet, but it can only mimic the human condition.
Yeah, exactly. So there is a definite profit-driven progression of technology, of course. There's also moral and philosophical discussions that are being silenced around this. And it's one of those things where the silence is often happening from those who are using technology, which is basically us, because we've become so dependent on it. And so we don't know any other way. Like, take an iPad away from a 4-year-old, it's like the end of the world. And so parents would rather have the iPad like literally attached to the kid so that, they can feed the child, bathe the child. Like it's become such an integral part of our lives. And so we do have that separation anxiety from technology. How crazy is that? It's no longer to a human being. Like, we go through, breakups all the time. But, is breaking up with a human being more difficult than breaking up with your addiction to iPhone? Like, how can that be a serious question now?
Fuck. Yeah. Touche. So it's kind of a hard question for me to answer on two levels. One, because it's so true, and then two, I'm actually not one of those scrollers. I am actually, I still see it consistently. Yeah, I mean, the day that I lose my phone, I'm like, yes, like, I'm so happy to have like lost my phone. I'm so happy that like no one can call me on WhatsApp. I'm so happy that I can't get on the news sites. I'm so happy that so genuinely, I'm actually one of the extremely strange people that probably would feel absolutely delighted and relieved at having my phone confiscated for me for a certain period of time. And at some level, the codependency is going to return. You want me to go without a phone for a week? I'm probably going to struggle a bit more. I just wouldn't know. My life is just too dependent on it in that way. The logistics of my life, I just can't ignore my phone for a certain period of time. And knowing that I still couldn't do more than a week without it is disconcerting, definitely disconcerting. And so I guess we get to a point where I want to bring this in. I kind of want to get to the point of talking about what happened to your TED talk. I guess I just want to give you the floor to wrap up this conversation on the broader notions of instinct and what's happening to humanity as a result of technology. And then we get to a point where you've done your TED talk in February 2024 at Burley Head's TEDx talk, and waiting to see it to come out, and it never does. And it turns out that TED have censored your talk, and it's on YouTube, but it can only be accessed through the link. And this confused me to no end. And so I think, just to wrap up, I think I want to give you the floor to wrap up the broader conversation around the topics that you were talking about itself. And then from there, describe how you felt. Describe how, I've read your Facebook post, like, this was a dream come true for you. Describe how you felt seeing that, something that you put your heart and soul and your mind too, like every part of you, to create something that was valuable for humanity as a conversation. And it just, the first line of the reason that they censored it was, some viewers may find this talk objectionable or offensive. No one's saying that to transhumanists, are they? So yeah, just wrap up the TEDx talk that you did, and then give me a little bit about how you felt.
Yes, I might actually start off with the feeling first, because that kind of paints the picture of the journey that I took to be there. So I've been preparing to be a TEDx speaker for 10 years. One of the talks that I did in 2014 is the same idea, but a little bit immature at that stage. And so the maturity of this idea has happened over a span of 10 years. I dedicated my life to be able to deliver a talk like this. I constantly put myself on bigger and bigger stages so that one day I might be able to stand on that red dot. Just for this talk alone, I had 3 speaking coaches, one in the research phase, one in the scripting phase, and a third in the delivery phase. I went over 40 revisions so that the science checked out. I read hundreds of articles to make sure that whatever I said was watertight. It wasn't anything like, you won't be able to pick up anything in the talk that scientists don't agree with. And so for that level of preparation and that level of delivery, TED still found a way to censor this talk, and the reasons they gave me were made up reasons. They found a opinion piece on something around brain volume, which was a paper against the fact that the brain volume changed within the space of 3,000 years. It wasn't a research article, it was an opinion piece, which was later refuted by the authors that claimed that piece.
You're kidding. That was what it was.
That was one thing. So you can start observing the level of incompetence. So the last 90 years of research, and bear in mind I did study paleontology as well in my postgrad, there isn't a single scientist who would dispute the fact that across all hominids, there's been an increase in human brain volume. Australopithecus africanus, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Homo neanderthal, like every evolution of the human lineage has found an increase in brain volume. Then we reach Homo sapiens, and from the late Pleistocene to the Holocene, brain volume decreases by 200 milliliters. That's a substantial reduction. There isn't a scientist on the planet that will go against that. That is just observable data. What can be questioned is how sharply that decline happened. Some say 3,000 years, some may argue 5 to 10,000 years. But no one disagrees that it did not happen. And so they took an opinion piece of that, and they said, like this one obscure paper may, is holding my talk from humankind. And they also talked about IQ. And I said that the IQ is declining. Like in 2013, Professor James Flynn gave an astounding talk around how our IQ is higher than our grandparents. And that was true for that time, because as education standards increased, so did our IQ levels. But then we reached a turning point. So that talk was delivered in 2013 on the TEDx stage. In 2018, Professor James Flynn published an article stating, the title of the article said, "The rot starts from the top."
This is James Flynn, the same guy.
Same guy. And in this article, he talks about how industrialized societies who had access to education have now hit the laws of diminishing return. And in the next generation, in the next 30 years, they'll lose as much as 6 to 7 IQ points. This is his own words. Societies that reached industrialization later, such as South Korea, are still seeing increases in IQ. But for countries like the Scandinavian countries, which were highly educated, now they're seeing a decline in IQ. TED deliberately ignored this research. It's from the same guy. I'm not coming up with, So you can see there was nothing wrong with the science itself. TED selectively chose specific articles to create an impossible standard for me. I don't know what else to do here. I did my research.
I don't know what to say, man. We've all wanted to do a TED Talk. Like, it's become like, welcome to my TED Talk. Thanks for listening. Whenever you go on a bit of a rant or a tangent, say something you think might be smart, it's like, it's a cultural, like, icon. Like, it must have felt just, I don't know, just, I would imagine betrayed.
I did go through all these emotions, and you got to understand, when people do a TED Talk, there's a sense of accomplishment that, wow, we achieved something, and you reap the rewards of that accomplishment. For me, it's as if once it was announced that my TED Talk will be not made public, would be censored, I didn't get that. I didn't get that reward. I didn't get that accomplishment. I didn't get that rest that I required from all that work that I put in.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's as if now I have to keep fighting for this talk to be noticed. Otherwise, I'll fall through the cracks and no one would know.
Dude, I'm sorry, man. That's rough. It would just be so hard to come to terms with the why. Like, in the words of Simon Sinek, in the most famous TED Talk of all time, like, why? Because the best reason that I could see for particularly looking at what they've written, like in the notes for why they censored it, like in public, some viewers may find this talk objectionable or offensive. I definitely did not. Please do not look to this talk for mental health advice. This talk only represents the speaker's personal views and understanding of evolution, technology, and the brain. Several claims lack legitimate scientific support. The only reason I thought could be possible was because first you talked about going to live in a cave, and then you talked about technology making people have mental health problems. And I'm like, are they seriously worried they're going to get sued because some parents are going to like send their kids off to a cave to like live with cobras because this guy's said that that technology is making kids anxious? Like, I could not work out what it was. And and then I was wondering what the part about, represent the speaker's personal views and understanding of evolution, technology, and the brain. And so that made me think a little bit deeper about this and think that there is some form of pushback about the overall narrative that technology is in some way, shape, or form changing humans, which starts to make it, and I don't believe I'm smart enough to read into this in a way that where I'm right. Like, all I can do is sort of put what's in my brain forward. I can't figure out why they have blocked this from being a part of the public discourse. It's like nuanced enough and it's existential enough to the future of humanity that it feels like a view that is worth having in the public, to be debated, to be spoken about, for people who don't agree with you to come out and be like, you know what, I actually don't agree with this guy, here's why. It completely flies in the face of what TED, I mean, I don't really want to say this, but I'm going to say it feels like it flies in the face of what TED's all about. It just, like, where is the interest in exploring new ideas? Like, and just debating them and discussing them and saying, okay, like, all right, well, here's a perspective and a lot of science backing it up. Like, let's talk about it. That's just been completely wiped off the table by the most respected organization about the future of ideas on the planet, which is crazy. And so again, I don't know. And I think it's important to say, I don't know if either of us can know what's going on behind closed doors, but why do you think that this happened?
So Obviously, I don't have any political affiliations, or I don't subscribe to any conspiracies, nothing like that. But if you think about what has happened for someone in our generation, for example, Jordan Peterson, when 10 years ago he started openly talking about his concerns, he was cancelled. He was ostracized because those conversations were going against the narrative. And I'm standing in the position where Jordan Peterson was 10 years ago, talking about something that I foresee, and one of those things has already happened. I talked about, in the talk 2 months before ChatGPT Omni was released, that humans will face that fact of encountering an intelligence that is not human for the first time. And it's like, for the first time, communicating with something that is alien. And now we have that. What we're speaking to is not human, although it's been trained on human data, although it mimics the voice of a seductive human being. It is not human. And people are creating emotional bonds with it. To not address this concern is alarming. Why wouldn't we have this conversation right now? This is the Oppenheimer moment of our time. And we're silencing these discussions. I don't know why, but it has happened.
I think there's two parts to this GPT Omnia thing that come up for me. The first part is that to me, it feels like there could be a constructive debate, which we don't have time for right now, but I will just flag it, that asking whether or not this thing that people are talking to, i.e. ChatGPT, is intelligent in the sense of like artificial general intelligence, or AGI. And so there could be debate around the idea of like, is this thing intelligent? I think so. That's one part of this. And then I think the second part of this is that I don't know if it matters if it's actually intelligent. And there's also a question of like what you mean by intelligent. Do you mean sentient? Do you mean, so there's like a whole different that's a kettle of fish that would require a whole nother podcast in itself to talk about. The second part of things I think is super interesting is that, does it actually matter whether it's intelligent or not? Because people are going to treat it like it is. And the way that we are going to start, I had this conversation with Craig on an earlier podcast, like kids are going to have better relationships with their AI friends than they are their real friends. And why wouldn't they? Because their AI friends are going to know exactly what to say, how to say it, and when to say it in order to like make that kid feel, accepted or happy or whatever. And then they're going to like get pushback from their real friends, because their real friends are human beings with their own lives and stuff going on and opinions and whatever. And they're going to be like, well, Jimmy from Snapchat doesn't say that, so fuck you. Like, it's just, I mean, that's going to be an interesting part. So I think there's like two parts of that conversation that is a segue from the point that we're talking about, that there is censorship of anything that goes outside of the dominant narrative, and the dominant narrative being, I mean, if you extrapolate this to like history, like who writes the history books, the winners, who's winning right now, and it's because it's incredible. It's crazy that this is the dominant narrative, because the world that I live in, and it makes me go, holy shit, like what world do I live in right now? Because the world I live in, I've not heard anyone say about your talk that this is against the dominant narrative. And so that fracturing that you're talking about of humanity is definitely happening, because I work in tech And I still don't understand how this is the dominant narrative. This is crazy to me that there is, I don't know how big the minority of people are, but there is a minority of people that are controlling or dictating the narrative around where society and humanity is going that seems at total odds with the world I live in. And like, again, like with all, like, I just, like, I don't know, like like, I'm not shit talking the dominant narrative or anything like that. It's not about that. It's about allowing other narratives to be spoken and allowing the discourse of the next steps of humanity to have these ideas. Like, we need a Cambrian explosion of ideas that will talk about culture, that will talk about technology, will talk about science, will talk about art, that will talk about economics, and how all those things relate to each other in a rapidly changing world. And it just seems like the people that actually have the power to control that narrative and that conversation don't want to do that right now.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And it's the way I see it is not any corporation or capitalism or anything controlling us. We are willingly giving our power away. We are the ones on the devices. We are the ones who are spending half our life sharing cat videos. And no one else is doing that for us. We intentionally do that. And so in the talk, I make a very clear and deliberate decision to not provide people with any advice, recommendations, solutions, because I don't have that. I'm only one human being. But what I do is provoke questions. And I think those questions are provocative enough for people to start thinking about what direction they want humanity to take. Because this is our discussion. This is a discussion of our species. This is where we've ended up. And we must now choose the direction that we move in.
Dr. Kaushik Ram, that is the perfect way to end this conversation. It's been a really deep dive into your own life, your own realizations, and into the perspectives and the questions that you want to offer to humanity to ask ourselves as we go into a pretty big time in our history. They're questions that I have thoroughly enjoyed, if not been a little bit, whoa. But it's necessary, and it's been a part of my journey of late as well to connect back into what makes us human. And thank you so much for coming on the show to talk about this. Thank you so much for giving me the time to be able to flesh this out with you. I absolutely loved talking about your journey. I think that that was something that we really did well. Like, I think that having listened to your talk, listening to the middle part of this episode is going to be really illuminating for people who want to dive into that talk a little bit more, and then to just be able to open up the conversation on censorship. So thank you so much for coming on the show. I think that, like, one of the things that can get so lost in a conversation like this is just, like, get out into nature. Like, the thesis of how all of this came to be for you was the connection that we have to nature, and realizing for ourselves the importance of instinct and the profound depth that you took away from your connection with nature. And so, if nothing else, get into nature, people. Oh my God. Like, I'm actually a bit, that was an incredible conversation. You are such a fascinating and deeply, deeply considered human. I thank you so much for coming on the show. It's been honestly incredible.
Yeah, thank you, Mike. I really do appreciate you taking the time to expose some of these discussions. and also the delicacy with which you approached this discussion. I really value that. So we had enough time to talk about each aspect and give it its own space to be explored. So I really appreciate that.
Thanks, man. I mean, I feel like we could have gone a lot longer and talked about a lot more. I do want to earmark another episode to talk about. I know you've talked about it a fair bit already, that piece around consciousness and cessation and meditation. That's my wheelhouse. So hopefully one day we can get together for another chat. But until next time, everyone, thank you so much for tuning into this show. Dr. Kaushik, thank you so much for coming on the show. And till next time, peace. Thank you so much for tuning into another installment of Unmapped. I really, really hope you enjoyed the episode. I always have a blast creating them, and it brings me so much joy to share them with you. As I said at the start, I'd really appreciate if you share, follow, and review the show if it feels right for you. I'd also like to thank my great mate Josh Ryan for the magic he makes in post-production, my studio partner Bondi Radio, and Arman at Moral Studios for the brand's design. I honestly could not do this by myself, so thank you, thank you, thank you. Until next time, I'm Mike Kelly, and this has been Unmapped.